On November the 7th, within a few days of the Balfour Declaration, the Bolsheviks took power in Russia. Lloyd George hoped that it would have the desired effect of appeasing the Jews in the communist leadership.
What is it that they supposedly so want, as Jews? Palestine. Now, the whole argument is totally illogical. It's a nonsense argument because these particular people, if one were to think of people like Trotsky or Zinoviev or Yaffe, some of the key Jewish leaders in the Russian Revolution, the November Revolution, these people, of course, are internationalists.
There were 15 to 20 Jews in the higher echelons of the Bolshevik Party. Most of them were anti-Zionist, and after they came to power, soon after they came to power, they issued a declaration to say that Zionism is a capitalist ploy, a capitalist idea.
The wildly inaccurate intelligence report on which Lloyd George based his strategy was to have major implications for Britain. Within weeks, Russia's new leaders did exactly the opposite of what he had expected. Not only did they pull out of the war, they opened up the archives of the Tsarist Foreign Office and published the secret treaties. The very treaties Britain had engineered with her allies to carve up the Ottoman Empire, and to which Russia had been privy.
That, of course, is a very great embarrassment to the Western Allies, because the Allies have been doing all sorts of deals behind the scenes in which they have handed out to each other large sections of the world, meanwhile openly preaching that they are fighting the war in defense of democracy, and of course also telling, among others, the Arabs, that they are supporters of self-determination for the peoples of the Ottoman Empire.
Publication of the secret treaties by the Bolsheviks certainly created enormous suspicion in the Arab world, and this meant that the Sharif Hussein and the others said, wait a minute, what's going on? Why are you not giving us independence? And secondly, why are you dividing us up into Zone A and Zone B? And at that point, of course, the Arabs realized that not only had the British got their own particular interests, for example, in the ports of Palestine or in Iraq, but that they had promised other things to the French.
Amid Arab confusion and suspicion, General Allenby entered Jerusalem on foot, together with Sykes, Picot, and a number of other Allied notables. His British-led forces had captured the Holy City in December 1917. The leaders of the Arab revolt, however, were nowhere to be seen. Fearing that Hussein and Faisal might lose heart, the British government forwarded a message to them, reiterating British commitment to Arab independence.
The Arab race shall be given full opportunity of once again forming a nation in the world. This can only be achieved by the Arabs themselves uniting, and Great Britain and her allies will pursue a policy with this ultimate unity in view.
Hussein stayed loyal to the Allied cause, still prepared to accept Britain's word on Arab independence, although he spoke of settling accounts after the war. From Allenby's point of view, he continued to rely on Arab support in the war against the Ottomans. But now that Jerusalem had been occupied by the British, one party seized the initiative. In April 1918, Chaim Weizmann and the International Zionist Commission traveled to Palestine to lay the foundation for a Hebrew university. Their hope was that it would become the intellectual hub of Zionism. Weizmann's visit, however, caused widespread alarm and indignation among the Arab population. And when he and the chief rabbi of Jerusalem met General Allenby, it looked as if Britain was preparing to honor the Balfour Declaration. Six months later, Allenby's forces entered Damascus. With their ally, Faisal's northern army, they had pushed the Ottoman troops north through Palestine into Syria.
The Arab revolt did contribute to the victory of the Allies. First of all, it protected the British flank in Palestine. Second, it kept a number of Turkish and German troops preoccupied. And third, the British could have never legitimized what they were doing unless they had the blessing of a particular Arab force.
On the 3rd of October, the people of Damascus flocked to Faisal's victory parade. If he was to seize power, he knew it was of great importance to make his presence felt and to be seen by the Arab people as their liberator. Later the same day, however, Faisal met with General Allenby at the Victoria Hotel in Damascus. Allenby warned him that his rule in Syria would be limited.
The British, by that time, knew that they were going to hand over Syria to the French, so they couldn't actually accept Faisal as a legitimate ruler. All they could do is to pay him his salary and the expenses of his army and his administration.
Undaunted by Allenby's warnings, Faisal assumed the title of governor of Damascus. With the support of his father, Sharif Hussein, he set about creating a power base for their goal of an independent Arab state. On the 31st of October, the Ottomans were finally defeated. And at 11 o'clock on the 11th of November 1918, the guns fell silent in Europe as the war with the Central Powers came to an end. The peace conference at Versailles began in January 1919. Representatives of the victorious Allies, such as the French Prime Minister Clemenceau and the American President Woodrow Wilson, gathered to sort out what was to be done with the former territories of the defeated empires. Now, the liberal use of promises by the British government had to be prioritized.
They did indeed make pledges to the Arabs, but they also made pledges to the Jews. And they also made pledges to the French and the Russians and everybody else. And these people saw the world as an imperial world. Not only did they want to carve out the Middle East, they wanted to carve out Russia. They thought this was the last great moment in which the imperial powers would be able to sit down and grab what was going, particularly since there was no one to stop them.
But Britain and her old ally France were up against the American President Woodrow Wilson's vision of a new world order which promoted national self-determination.
Once independence had seemed to be a possibility, that this principle of self-determination supported by the Americans was going to be offered to all those who were to be liberated from former empires like the Habsburgs and the Ottomans. What the Palestinians wanted was an independent state.
In fact, Faisal had come from Damascus to plead the Arab cause. But the future of Palestine in the Middle East formed part of Britain's pledge to France in the Sykes-Picot carve-out. In the event, Woodrow Wilson's principles about self-determination were forgotten when it came to the people of the Middle East. Britain and France were free to go ahead with their agreement. But what of the promises Britain had made to the Jews regarding Palestine? Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour, in a confidential memo during the Versailles peace talks with America, France, and Italy, wrote,
"The four great powers are committed to Zionism, and Zionism, be it right or wrong, good or bad, is rooted in age-long traditions, in present needs, in future hopes, of far profounder import than the desires and prejudices of the 700,000 Arabs who now inhabit that ancient land."
That might sound like a warm endorsement of Zionism, yet further in the post-war memorandum, Balfour hints at a much more cynical agenda.
So far as Palestine is concerned, the powers have made no declaration of policy, which at least in letter, they have not always intended to violate.
The Versailles Peace Conference was concluded on June the 28th, 1919, with the creation of the League of Nations, the first global institution for peace and security. Its covenant provided that the Arab and other territories ceded by the defeated Ottoman Empire should be administered by mandates, which meant, in effect, that Britain and France were given the authority to impose their rule over the Arab territories. On November the 21st, 1919, François-Georges Picot, the co-architect of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and the French General Gouraud arrived in Beirut, and so began the imposition of the French mandate for Syria and Lebanon. The British forces, who had occupied the region since ousting the Ottoman Turks during the last months of the war, were handing over power to the French, thus fulfilling their wartime pledge. Faisal, who had been the governor of Damascus now for 16 months, had been consolidating his position. When he was proclaimed king by the Syrian National Congress, the French were incensed, and General Gouraud sent in his troops. By August the 7th, 1920, Faisal had been deposed and had to flee to Palestine. The promises to Sharif Hussein and Faisal of a single independent state were now a distant memory for the Europeans.
The whole issue of spheres of influence meant that what was at first appeared to be a willingness to accept a single Arab state was in fact seriously diluted. And then on top of that, of course, the very fact of there being a French area and a British area meant that in effect this was the seed of partition. So you had both independence was denied, but also the unity of this area was denied.
The boundaries and governments of the Middle Eastern states that emerged bore the unmistakable imprint of the Sykes-Picot Agreement. The French half of the previously Ottoman province of Greater Syria became the mandate for Lebanon and Syria. The other half became the British mandate for Transjordan and Palestine. In the east, the Ottoman area of Mesopotamia, which included the oil fields of Mosul, was given to Britain as the mandate for Iraq.
So this was basically the importance of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, to divide what is called the Fertile Crescent between Iraq and Syria and let Britain get access to the oil of the area and be able to exploit it in the future.
But British rule was initially rejected by the Iraqi people until Faisal was installed as king in July 1921. Britain hoped the limited power it devolved to him would serve to placate the frustrated demands for Arab independence. But Sharif Hussein expected more from the British.
He never gave up the idea that the British had promised him independence, not only in Arabia, but in Syria and Iraq as well. And he wanted the British to fulfill their promises.
Sharif Hussein's dream of an Arab kingdom ruled by the Hashemites was only partially fulfilled. For although his other son, Abdullah, became king of Transjordan, their old rival, Ibn Saud, swept the Hashemites out of Hijaz when he conquered the whole of the Arabian Peninsula. in Jerusalem. An administration was established by the British in the spring of 1920. There were no plans for devolving power in Palestine. Palestine was a land sacred to three religions. Jews were a small minority who had lived harmoniously with Christians and the much larger community of Muslims for hundreds of years. But the Balfour Declaration, promising Jews a homeland in Palestine, had been incorporated into the British mandate at Versailles. Palestine was thus to be opened for new European Jewish immigration. With celebrations and parades in support of Zionist activities, it seemed as if the British were going to honor their pledges to the Jews and ignore Palestinian hopes of independence.
The Arabs had a strong case, but very poor advocates. The Zionists had a case. It wasn't as strong as that of the local Arabs, but they had brilliant advocates. Zionism is one of the greatest public relations success stories of the 20th century, and Chaim Weizmann exemplified these traditional Jewish skills of advocacy and persuasion.
Some of these skills were clearly in evidence when Weizmann and various Zionist groups helped finance land purchases and the building of settlements for immigrant Jews. At the same time, political and security organizations were created to support the emerging Jewish homeland. The Arab community in Palestine was incensed.
The Palestinians couldn't conceive their country being divided or given away to another community which had nothing to do with the Middle East in the first place and was almost wholly European at the time. So to them, it seemed absurd that 600 to 700,000 should give up their land, their homes, their villages, their towns, and hand them over to a minority which was dispersed throughout Palestine. And Palestine, after all, is named after its people, who are the Palestinians.
In 1925, Arthur Balfour toured the new Jewish settlements in Palestine. Although he was feted as a hero of the Zionist cause, the immigration of European Jews was to have unforeseen consequences for British rule in Palestine.
I believe that the Balfour Declaration was one of the most serious mistakes in British imperial history. It committed Britain to support of Jewish nationalism in Palestine after the war, and it did not produce any immediate benefits for Britain.
Without the Balfour Declaration, there could have been no genuine development of a Jewish national home, and the follow-through in 1948, where you get the creation of a State of Israel, simply would not have happened. It requires the umbrella of the British to be there, in effect, to support the emerging Jewish national home, militarily at the bottom line. The very fact that there are British troops, British policemen there to protect the Jewish communities is ultimately central to the situation. It could not have been done in any other way.
Throughout the 1930s and 40s, the years of Nazi persecution and the Holocaust, Jewish immigration to Palestine increased rapidly. But what was seen by the Arabs as an alien incursion and the Jews as a fulfillment of historic rights led to polarization and violence. In response to terrorist acts by Arabs, Britain restricted the immigration, but the policy only stimulated Jewish terrorism. Against this background, Britain relinquished its mandate, and the State of Israel was born in 1948. When the first of several wars between the new state and its Arab neighbors began, thousands of Palestinian Arabs fled their homeland. Thus, the strategies employed by Britain to win the First World War inadvertently left a deep divide between Arab and Jew.
The most serious consequences of British policy during the war was the encouragement of Arab nationalism and Jewish nationalism. And in the aftermath of the First World War, Britain was left with this legacy of double dealing and of betrayal, which was to haunt her for a long, long time.
Clearly, it played a role in dividing the Arab world into different states, in allowing the establishment of the State of Israel, and in frustrating Arab desires. But if what happened in Sykes-Picot and everything else that happened in the First World War is used as an excuse for the problems of the Middle East now, I think that would be a mistake. But yes, the roots of what we see today certainly arose from the double dealing of the First World War and from the frustrated expectations of that time.